I'll be speaking to Isaac Evans-Frantz, the executive director of the Action Corps, which is a national grassroots advocacy organization. And we're going to talk about the latest effort of activists to stop U.S. aid for the Saudi war on Yemen. Good morning.
Good morning.
So as I understand it, the idea was to use the War Powers Resolution to stop U.S. aid for that war. Could you remind our viewers of the powers of this War Powers Resolution? What was it designed to do?
Well, first of all, the Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution says that Congress, not the president, has the power to declare war. And we've seen a pattern where president after president has entered conflicts around the world, bombing other countries, ground troops, these wars that Congress never authorized. The 1973 War Powers Act reiterated the Constitution and provided a means for members of Congress to call the question on U.S. participation in conflicts around the world that they had not authorized. And the War Powers, and that 1973 War Powers Act says that any member of Congress can introduce a resolution to the floor of the United States House of Representatives or the United States Senate to call the question. And it bypasses the normal committee structure where you have, where bills will get stuck in committees. It's said to be privileged, meaning that any member of Congress can move this forward. And that's exactly what members of Congress have done recently. This past spring and summer, Representative DeFazio in the House of Representatives and Senator Sanders in the Senate introduced a joint War Powers Resolution about the U.S. participation in the Saudi-led coalition in the war in Yemen. And last night, on Tuesday,
before we get to the breaking
news,
so there was also a lot of organizations behind this. It wasn't just something that the people in Congress thought of. Could you talk a bit about, I think it was something like 150 organizations?
Well over 100 organizations have written to Congress asking them to support this Yemen War Powers Resolution. And that's just national organizations, plus all of the local and statewide organizations from around the country that have supported. This has been an effort that's been going on for years. It was in large part because of grassroots activists that we got the Yemen War Powers Resolution passed through the Senate in 2018, through a Republican-controlled Senate, and then through a divided Congress in the spring of 2019. What's interesting about this is that a number of conservative organizations, as well as a number of progressive organizations, have been supporting this Yemen War Powers Resolution. I mean, just in the last few days, we're seeing statements and calls to action from Code Pink for Peace. We're also seeing organizations like that and Just Foreign Policy, Demand Progress. And you're also seeing calls from the Americans for Progress, from the Cato Institute, and these conservative organizations, many conservative organizations, the Libertarian Party. I mean, you see this more conservative effort too, because it turns out that there are a lot of people who care about the Constitution and what it says. And there are a lot of people who also care about U.S. resources and that they shouldn't be being used to starve people to death in other countries.
All right, so last night was supposed to be a procedural vote on this resolution, but there was a big development. What happened?
Yes, so Bernie Sanders went to the floor of the U.S. Senate, and he said that he was withdrawing his request for a vote, that he had received communications from the administration that they wanted to sit down and talk and work with his office to come up with something that they could all agree to.
How do you feel about that?
It's disappointing. This is something that we've been working for years, and it's been almost 2 years since that Global Day of Action, World Says No to War on Yemen, when we brought together 400 organizations from 30 countries and calling on Biden to make good on that campaign promise of stopping U.S. participation in this war. And it's been almost 2 years of us calling on Bernie and his friends to move forward with this vote. I mean, in January of 2021, so almost 2 years ago, Representative Ro Khanna spoke at a public rally online that we had helped organize with Action Corps and the Yemeni Alliance Committee and other organizations. And Ro Khanna said on that call, Senator Sanders and I are introducing the Yemen War Powers Resolution to finally stop U.S. participation in this war. It's almost 2 years later, and that vote still hasn't happened. So that's how I feel on the one hand. On the other hand, what I see is that we are progressing. So we had a year ago, for instance, Senator Murphy, who had been a real leader on this effort to stop U.S. participation in this war. A year ago, he helped greenlight a major weapons sale to Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And we were really disappointed about that backsliding. It seemed like flip-flopping to us. But you know what? Yesterday, he was putting out tweets in support of the Yemen War Powers Resolution. So to have him back on board is fantastic. That's important. That's the work of the advocacy community. We also saw Senator Mike Lee, from the Republican from Utah. He's back on board. He's been engaged. We saw that Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. He's also supportive of this Yemen War Powers Resolution. And I've heard from the other folks in our network are having conversations with other Republican offices that are also supportive. And that's fantastic that we're building that support. We had multiple rallies in front of Senator Menendez's office as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in New Jersey. So people are coming together and there's energy, and that's fantastic. And what's important is that we keep that energy going into the new year and that we get that vote, and that we ask Bernie to introduce the same language in early 2023 when we have the new Congress.
I understand you had a personal interaction with the White House spokesman about Saudi Arabia. Could you describe it?
Yeah, I was recently at the Victory Institute's International LGBTQ Leaders Conference. The closing plenary included Ned Price, who's the spokesperson for the Department of State. Mr. Price is a fellow gay man, and I asked him what it's like for him as a fellow gay man to have this role where he's defending the Saudi dictatorship, which is murdering members of our community, where flogging and death are the legal punishment for homosexuality. And this is a dictatorship that is violating women's rights, which is starving children in next door Yemen. And how does he justify that being in a position where he's defending a relationship with that?
I'm curious about what it's like for you in your role as a fellow gay man to be essentially having to defend a relationship with the Saudi dictatorship that's been persecuting members of our community, and that part of the law is that there's penalty of death, flogging for members of our community, and how it is for you and how you do that at the same time, and a dictatorship that's waging war and starving children in Yemen and violating women's rights. How do you justify being a spokesperson for a country that maintains a relationship with a dictatorship?
I appreciate the question. It's a good one. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, and this is not a dynamic, unfortunately, that is unique to Saudi Arabia. But we have two choices. We can try to engage with Saudi Arabia. We can try to have a recalibrated relationship, a relationship that reflects our interests and our values. Or we can say, as there's a push to do, to hell with them. We're done with them. We're never going to engage with them. We're going to sever our relationship. If we want to have influence on what Saudi Arabia is, what Saudi Arabia does, if we want to have influence on any country that is not reflective of not only America's values, but values that should be universal, it doesn't do us any good to say the hell with it.
So Mr. Price basically responded that we need constructive engagement, and essentially saying that we need to hold Saudi Arabia close so that we can have influence over their policies. Now, this is a failed strategy. We have not seen that the weapon sales, that the military support for the Saudi intervention in Yemen have resulted in that. For 7.5 years, this humanitarian crisis has unfolded. It's become one of the largest humanitarian crises on the planet. Almost 75% of the population of Yemen is dependent on, in some way, on humanitarian assistance. You have half the hospitals aren't functioning, the largest cholera outbreak in history. It's so extreme, and the United States has had a huge role in creating this crisis. And
I remember the term constructive engagement. It started with Ronald Reagan with South Africa, with apartheid.
And Ned Price didn't use that exact phrase, constructive engagement, but that's what he was describing. It's the exact same doctrine that the Reagan administration used for defending apartheid in South Africa and an ongoing support for South Africa during apartheid. And that's was the justification that the Reagan administration used for vetoing the bill from Congress to basically punish South Africa. And fortunately, Congress overrode that veto. I mean, that's awesome. There was so much organizing and so much power in the United States. It was really led by grassroots activists to stop apartheid in South Africa.
I know your time is limited. I only have two questions. Just about conditions there. I mean, there's this truce, but there's also the blockade that's continuing. And I don't think people know much about the blockade. Could you describe that?
Yes. The Saudi blockade of Yemen is starving the people. It is depriving people of medicine. Medicine is not able to get through. There's been some food's been able to get through, but medicine is not. Spare parts for the water treatment facilities not been able to get through. And Saudi Arabia is preventing that from happening. And the Saudi Royal Air Force is patrolling the coasts of Yemen and enforcing this blockade. And guess who's servicing those fighter jets? It's U.S. military contractors supervised by U.S. military personnel. So the United States is very much complicit and enabling this blockade of Yemen.
What about the Navy? Do U.S. ships participate in the blockade?
I'm not aware of U.S. ships, but there certainly is a naval blockade of Yemen, as well as an air blockade, if you will. While there's been some loosening and some ships have been allowed in and some flights in and out of the airport in Sana'a, Yemen, have been allowed, it's far from what's needed.
My last question is, what could our viewers, if they want to engage on this, what is some of the best things they could do?
So the best thing that people can do is to call the congressional switchboard and ask for your senator, and then you can call back and ask for your representative and ask them to support the bill to stop U.S. participation in the war in Yemen, for them to co-sponsor the Yemen War Powers Resolution. These bills are still active. They're still in Congress. Any members of Congress can co-sponsor the Yemen War Powers Resolution. For instance, Senator Murphy, it would be fantastic if he would co-sponsor the Sanders Yemen War Powers Resolution. He's committed support. Why not become a co-sponsor to build that momentum?
Thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you.